Hello, students. Let's talk about Chapter 15 in Lifespan Development on peer context. So what we're talking about here is the peers affecting people's lives throughout their lifespan. So here we've got Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. You can see peers is a big part of the microsystem. The people that you're interacting with regularly, the people who have a big impact on your development. If we look at Lerner's model here, the developmental contextual model, we can see an individual here and their social network, their school network. Some of that community is also going to be part of that peers. And over time, these people impact you. So we'll look at childhood all the way through late adulthood, some of the functions peers play in our lives, and some of the things, some of the benefits, some of the risks for peers as well. So let's jump into that. A peer, in and of itself, is really just an individual around the same age or maturity level as any individual. So if you are 40, your peers are probably a pretty wide range of people, right? Because they're around the same age and maturity level. You can get people who are maybe a decade younger and older that you would consider your peers, versus if you're, say, a first grader, probably just like a year one way or another, you might consider your peers. If they're about 2 years older than you, they're probably at much bigger maturity level, or 2 years younger than you, probably much younger maturity level. So with this, peers provide a really good source of information and like comparison of what's happening in the real world outside of your family. So family context, parent context, those are some of the main contexts that are influencing, especially early on in life. But as we grow, peers become a bigger and bigger impact. And so they give us a good way to kind of get feedback on what we're doing, how we're doing. If we have friends, they might give us direct feedback. We might ask them questions. So peer influence can be positive or negative. We see that children and people who are more autonomous from their peers, so they don't seem to need peers as much, a little more autonomy, do is predictive of avoiding problem behaviors later on. But these people also tend, especially if you're higher on that autonomy scale, you just don't need friends. You also have less practice, and so you are not establishing strong relationships as well. So one of the biggest risk factors we see is for rejected peers. So if you are rejected or neglected by peers, this is very predictive of loneliness, hostility towards other people, and it's a big risk factor for mental health decline as well. So, and that's one thing that we'll talk about is, especially in childhood, adolescence, if you're not practicing the relationships, your relationship skills, your social skills are not going to develop as quickly as your peers who are getting practice with those. And so social skills are a skill. It's something you can build. It's something you can lose. So I definitely felt after COVID, some of my social skills had been lost with not interacting with peers in the same face-to-face way for such a long time. So with this, peer context, especially in childhood through adolescence, is influenced by the parent context too. So there's a lot of overlap there. So if we jump back to this slide here, you can see all of these systems are interacting with each other. And so these are some ways that the parent system is interacting with the peer system. Especially in earlier childhood, parents are going to say choose their neighborhood, maybe choose schools, choose, maybe they have friends, like the parents themselves have friends, and so maybe they're encouraging kids to be friends with their parents' peers. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. With that, also they might take them to friends' houses for play dates, or like invite more kids to birthday parties, things like this. So parents have a lot of management of those peer relationships, especially earlier on in childhood. As they get into adolescence, adolescents might have more autonomy with their peers. But at the same time, children are also learning some of those social skills through the modeling of their parents. As their parents are interacting with their peers, with each other as well, they might be learning, like, how do adults interact with each other as a model of how should people be interacting with each other. But peer interaction is influenced by the type of context that you're in. And the type of So one of those contexts is the type of peer. Is this an acquaintance? So someone you don't really know very well? Is this someone in a crowd? So a crowd is essentially peers that are similar age, but they're all kind of like in a group. So you might say like the whole basketball team might be a crowd. They all have some group thing around. The band kids are a crowd. Even though not all the band kids hang out together, you might consider that a crowd in high school. A clique would be, let's say there's a group of band kids who are really, really into band and they're like all friends with each other. And they're hanging out with each other. That would be a clique. So it's a smaller group. And so you might look at the movie Mean Girls. So the Plastics would be an example of a clique, a smaller group that are all really close friends, versus a crowd would be something like everybody in a specific category of friends. So a friend would be someone who you're close with, who you're sharing things with, being more intimate in the sense that you're sharing things, they're sharing things with you, you spend time together. And then a romantic partner might have been in one of those other groups, but now is someone that's closer to you. So with that, the location of these friends and these peers are also important. So it depends on how much time you spend in these different locations, but you might have different relationships with peers in your school versus your neighborhood versus your church versus a community center. You might have different kinds of crowds and cliques in these different places. In some cases, for example, I grew up went to high school in Indiana. It was a fairly rural town, and essentially all of these things were the same. So there were a couple different churches, but aside from that, the community, the sports teams, the neighborhoods, the schools, all of the cliques and the crowds overlapped in all of them because everybody went to the same places. But in a city like where my spouse grew up, in Southern California, there were a ton of different activities people could do, a lot of different places. And so the people at church or in the neighborhood were very different from the people at school. Some of the friends at school didn't, some of the people on the same street as my wife did not go to the same school, this kind of thing. So the location and the type of peer can influence those dynamics. And it can lead to, in some cases, having really positive experiences with peers in one location and not positive experiences with peers in another location. And that can be really beneficial as well for a young person who maybe is having a harder time with peers in school. If they have, say, a church or a neighborhood or a club or a sport that has other peers, and they can have positive relationships there. You might see some risk factors over here for school, maybe even something like bullying. But then if they have another kind of location, say a sports team or community club, and they have positive relationships there, that risk factor can be balanced out or kind of overwritten by the protective factor of the other location. So these are things to be aware of if you are someone who is one, a parent, if you are a mentor of young people, if you're a teacher, if you're going into nursing, whatever it might be, understanding that having other locations and other kind of peer groups can be really beneficial is really useful. Because that can be kind of a safe haven for a young person if there is one place where they feel more positive versus another place they don't feel as positively about their peers. So as long as they're getting that chance to have some positive relationships, practice their social skills, even if it's a much lower amount of time, can be really beneficial. So if you are someone like a nurse and you notice that a child is saying, or an adolescent is saying that they really don't like school because of all these negative things, encouraging a parent or recommending that the child also have outside of school activities with completely different peers would be a really good thing to suggest. So, going through some of the age groups, we'll start in early childhood, we'll go all the way to late adulthood, and we'll kind of jump around a little bit too. There's a couple topics to hit throughout this time. So, in early childhood, a lot of preschool age kids are more likely to have friends of varying genders. A lot of the peer relationships are kind of put together by the adults in their life, whether it's a classroom setting, whether it's play groups, things like that, a lot more likely to have a lot of different peer friends that are varying genders. So they might not have a lot of close friends yet, but they are interacting with a lot of people on average. Then in middle childhood, so getting into about elementary school age, oftentimes you're spending more time with friends. So more likely to be going on play dates, more likely to spend time with them in school, at recess. There's a lot more back and forth in these relationships. So you sharing something with them, they're sharing something with you, you play your game, then their game, and then the groups tend to be larger at this point than other times in life. They tend to shrink as we get further past middle childhood. And they're also getting more gender specific, so closer to the same gender as the person as we're aging as well. So with this, one of the things that we're building throughout lifespan, so this is a topic I'm putting here in middle childhood because we really start to see it here, but this is relevant across the lifespan, is social cognition. So how do you think social matters work? How does social situations work? How do you interact with people? How do you build relationships, hang on to relationships? These kinds of things. And so with this, as we get through middle to late childhood, this becomes more important. And so this is an example of what you would do in a social situation. You would attend to social cues, so you'd see what's going on in this situation. Maybe it looks like two people are arguing in your peer group or your friend group, let's say. You've got a clique, two of your friends in your clique are arguing, so you're attending to their social cues. You're trying to attribute intent. Is one person trying to hurt a person, or is the one person trying to get their donut, right? So you're trying to attribute intent to why they are doing things. Are they both hungry and they're just really grumpy because they're both hungry? That kind of thing. And then you generate goals. So what am I going to do? Am I going to stand back and let this play out? Am I going to intervene? Am I going to take one person's side or the other person's side? So then as you're determining those goals, you are calling on your behavioral scripts. You're deciding, what have I seen people do in the past? What kinds of things have I tried in the past? What is the general kind of pattern of behavior in this setting? And so again, if you don't have a lot of practice with social situations, you might not have as many scripts, you might not have a clear script for this situation, and that can make the decision-making part a little bit harder. So then you make a decision and you act on that behavior. You decide what you're going to do. So are you going to stand behind one of your friends? Are you going to intervene and help them calm down? That is all of the different things that go into how do you interact in a day-to-day situation. And this is happening all the time. Our brain is processing a lot of these different things all the time based on our previous patterns, how we have behaved in the past. So if we usually do intervene, if we usually take someone's side, our habit to do that will be kind of our default. It will become our default over time. Not to say that you can't change that, but it will take more effort to change that or do something different than you've built up that kind of pattern of social cognition. And so with this, these are really important skills to get along with peers. It's important now for you in life, where you're sitting now. It's important for early, middle, late children, adolescents, late adults, because our kind of social interactions help us maintain a social bond. Emotion plays a really big role in the success of these practices. So one, being able to regulate your emotions. If you're getting really mad at someone in the situation, it might be really appropriate to get really mad at them, or it might be more appropriate to calm down and act in a different way. So people that are emotionally moody or negative very often might be more often rejected by their peers. We see this a lot with children. So that's one reason why emotion regulation skills are really important. But with that, these emotions are important to empathize with people as well. And so any given person, so whether you're a child, whether you're an adolescent, whether you're an adult, you're probably working with people at your job. If you're in customer service, you probably have to emotionally regulate a lot, right? So if you have a customer that's very demanding, very rude, depending on your management style and the plan at that place, you might just have to regulate and maintain a social bond to maintain a pleasant demeanor kind of thing, right? If it's good friends that you've been friends with for a long period of time, you've got to, again, maintain those social bonds. If it's just your new coworker that you're meeting, you can maintain a social bond or build a social bond. So these are really important for getting along with people. Most of the things that we do in the world involve other people. So even my brother, who basically does computer programming for things like websites and apps, he still has to meet with people. He still has to have regular team meetings with the other members of a team to plan out things. So as much as he would like to maybe not have as many social interactions, he still needs these social skills. And with that, developing peer relationships that are positive are really important. So, especially in early childhood, learning to respond to conflicts in non-aggressive ways, learning to play together, learning to share, learning to do other pro-social behaviors, and then building that social knowledge are really important. But these aren't only things that early children are doing. So, even though we're kind of here at the middle childhood spot in the chapter, um, we're doing this all the time too. You're building your social knowledge, you're testing out roles, you're testing out behaviors, you're testing out new thoughts. How you manage relationships will hopefully change over your lifespan. Play will change over your lifespan, whereas before you might have played tag with your friends. Maybe now as an adult, you play other things with your friends. Maybe you play board games, right? So, but all of these are applicable all across the lifespan, and we start to see a lot of these things and these practices for practicing how to interact with peers early on in the lifespan. So that leads us to a couple different peer statuses. The way these peer statuses are defined is based on essentially what you would get from responses in a classroom full of young people. So in that classroom of, say, let's say 30 kids, you would ask them to rate all the peers in the class on a scale of 1 to 10, with 5 being average, 1 being you really don't like them, 10 being you like them a lot. So popular, and also ask who is your best friend. So you kind of ask those two questions, and this is how we get these different definitions. So popular children are those ones that pretty frequently get nominated as best friend and also don't have very many dislikes. So people are ranking them either average or towards the top of the scale, and also they have quite a few best friends. And with this, good social skills can help a young person be a popular child, right? So there is a bidirectional interaction here with when you are a popular child, you get more social reinforcement, you get more practice using your social skills, but also if you have had more practice with social skills before this time, you are more likely to be able to maintain relationships and have relationships in a way that peers might rate you highly and want to be your best friend. So with this, you get positive reinforcement from your interactions as a popular child. It does require maintaining those lines of communication with peers, but again, this is kind of a bidirectional interaction. You get practice with this. You probably got in that position because you've had practice with this and you have some of those social skills. So again, all of these are skills. Any given young person can learn some of the skills that they might need to maintain lines of communication. Generally, popular children are happy and have more control over their negative emotions. Again, they've got practice with these things. And then they generally show more enthusiasm and concern for others than some of the other subgroups that we'll talk about. They tend to be self-confident, but not conceited. So that is generally a lot of the things we see from popular children. And this isn't necessarily like the most popular child, but the children, again, that get nominated as best friends and also don't have a lot of dislikes. So this might be more than you might expect. This is not like the 1 or 2 most popular kids. A bigger group of people can be popular children. So average children are those who have kind of an average number of both positive and negative nominations, or kind of right in the middle. So there's not a lot of bad, not a lot of really good, somewhere more in the middle. And there's not a lot of risk factors there. There's not a lot of protective factors either. So like the popular children, it was a protective factor to a lot of things. Average children, again, just kind of average, not really risk factor, not really protective factor. For neglected children, on the other hand, these are infrequently nominated as best friend, but also not disliked by peers. So they don't have a lot of best friends, but they're also not actively disliked. They might be falling more in the average range. So it's kind of a young person or a group of young people who aren't really interacting much with other peers. So over time, they might not get as much practice, but they're probably getting more practice than, say, the controversial or rejected children. So really the controversial children and the rejected children that we'll see on the next slide are some of the highest risk factor that we have for young people. So controversial children are those ones that are frequently nominated as someone's best friend, but also someone that's disliked by other peers in the classroom. So they do have some best friends, but they're also very disliked by some people in the classroom. Sometimes we see bullies are controversial children. Sometimes we see that the bullying victims are controversial children. If you've got a lot of the class, for example, that are encouraging the bullying or getting in on the bullying, these individuals might dislike a child even though they have a couple friends that try to support them in that kind of situation. So it can go one way or the other, but it is a higher risk factor. The highest risk factors we see are those rejected children. So they're not nominated as best friend and they're actively disliked by peers. So nobody's really their best friend. They're not having a lot of those friendship interactions and people don't seem to like them in their classroom. Oftentimes we see significant adjustment problems for these young people. So we see a lot of depression, conduct problems, aggressiveness. These are all much more likely in rejected children. We also see them being angry or more impulsive, and this can turn off other peers from being friends. And again, this is a bidirectional interaction. So these kinds of things can lead to worse social skills. So because you don't have friends, because people don't like you, you might get upset, angry, lash out. You might already not have the social skills to try and maintain positive friendships. So because you're lashing out, maybe people like you less. So it's a really hard thing. So if you are a parent, a mentor, even a nurse, a coach, if anything in your realm of interaction is with young people, if you see people that are either rejected or seem to be controversial children that don't have a lot, that do have some negative views from some of their peers, they're ones that could probably use intervention. And so one thing that we mentioned is the different contexts for peers. So a rejected child might be rejected in their school. But if they have, say, a community club or sport or church group or something like that, where they have other peer groups, they might not be a rejected child in that group. And so this is one important thing, especially in areas where you might have no overlap between those kind of groups. If they're in, say, a martial arts class or something, and none of those kids are also in their school, they could have some positive relationships in one place, even if they don't have positive relationships in another. So even as someone like a nurse, if you notice some of these kinds of things, you can mention to, say, a parent and encourage them to get them involved in something outside of that peer group so that they can build some other good positive relationships. And some other setting, maybe they would be more of an average child or a popular child in that other context. So friendship does a lot of good things for us. So one of the big things is companionship. It's fun to have someone to do things with, who like the same things as you, to play the same games, watch the same shows, go to art shows together, whatever it might be. It's fun to have a companion to do those things with. Another thing that friendships provide us with is stimulation. So a friend might do something fun or exciting or different. And it can be, they might send you funny memes or a whole big list of TikToks, something like that. So they can provide stimulation, amusement, and that is a benefit to us. They can actually provide physical support. If you're probably watching this after a chapter where we covered more stress in more detail across the lifespan. With that, physical support is one thing that can support stress. So actual problem-focused coping, also emotion-focused coping. Friends can provide time, resources, assistance. So when I made my most recent move, I had friends help me move. So that was some really good physical support. So also ego support. So ego support is getting that feedback from your friends. It can help you see how competent you are at things. You can get a better rating or hopefully a better like assessment of how you're doing things, whether it's attractiveness, whether it's are you good at playing this instrument, all sorts of things. You can get some support about yourself from friends. Another function of friend is similar to that, social comparison. You can compare how they're doing to how you're doing, especially in early childhood. This is a really good way for children to see like what other people do outside of their family. So are you weird? Are you cool? What do your friends think? Do you think they're cool? How do you match up with them? And that's also important as we go through adolescence and finding identity and in early adulthood as well. Another thing is affection and intimacy. So intimacy being that closeness, sharing things with them sharing things with you, being warm and caring about those people. So disclosing things to them, sharing private thoughts, being a person that they can trust, you having people you can trust. These are all things that help people, one, come together and be happy, but also they're things that help you live a longer, healthier life for a variety of reasons. So, on the other hand, and we kind of alluded to this earlier with the controversial children, is bullying. So, we see a lot of negative risk factors for bullying. We see boys are more likely to be bullies. Again, if you look at a normal distribution, there is overlap here. So, this is not a 100% all the time. You only expect boys to be bullies. Also, boys and younger children are more likely to be victims. Bullies are often in the same class as the victim in, say, like school settings, so from elementary through high school. Oftentimes, other students are bystanders and don't really intervene, don't know how to intervene. It's actually one of the things the Heroic Imagination project that I'm part of tries to do is help young people know how to intervene, what can they do. And oftentimes, because of bullying, victims tend to be socially withdrawn, anxious, can be more aggressive as well because of these. So this can, first of all, lead to targeting, but also these can be outcomes from bullying. A lot of the other risk factors for negative outcomes are increased depression, difficulty making friends, agoraphobia, less self-esteem, bad school performance, even suicide. And as we see more and more cyberbullying, there's been a lot of research, especially in the last like 5, 7 years, about cyberbullying, as opposed to before that, it was more like physical bullying in a school setting. And we see that in some of the measures that we have, cyberbullying seems like it might be worse for a lot of these outcomes. So it's definitely something to be concerned with if you're in that kind of sphere where you might be involved with young people in any way. So, what are solutions? Well, there's a lot of things that have been tried, but really the things that work are, especially most of this research has been done in like elementary, middle, high school. The biggest thing to help is school-wide programs. So just having one single assembly a year, having some posters up on the wall, having like one class where you touch on it in health class. I remember my health class that, or my high school, that's basically all we did. Like freshman year, there was like the beginning of the school year where there was like a class like, we don't bully in this school. And then everybody was required to take like within their first year a health class. One of the things in the health class was a bullying unit. So for 2 days, we watched a movie about someone who was bullied and then took their own life. And then we had conversations about why we shouldn't bully. So I guess we got it 3 times, at least 3 days of it, which is better than some schools do with just like one assembly once a year. But really, those kinds of programs don't show much effect at all. Really, it needs to be a whole school climate, school culture change. And so, what we call this is a positive school culture or a positive school climate. And so this means that teachers, administration, staff, and the students as well are all on board with having a positive environment, have an environment where people can be themselves, feel welcomed, feel safe. And this is something that takes a lot of work. If this doesn't exist in a school, it can take a while to get to that point. And it does take buy-in from essentially everybody, or at least a big enough percentage of the population of the administrators, the students, the staff, the teachers, that they will move and change the culture. And so changing a bigger system like the whole school system, or often it works better if you're trying to do this in a whole school district. So then you're getting even people outside that school's administration, but also the other people in the community involved. You're also getting like district level people involved. That shows much more effect too. Those kind of big culture changes are hard, but they are the most effective. So socio-emotional learning and character education often infuses bits of anti-bullying programs and things that help to avoid bullying. Things like learning about empathy, how to build good relationships, how to respect one another. These all also help. And so again, the big changes takes time. It's hard to do. It might be a dramatic change from what you've been doing, but it's the thing that actually works. So there's a couple sources on the website. Greater Good Science Center from Berkeley is a good one. So that's one you can see. And then the Heroic Imagination Project is something I'm involved with. We try to teach young people to be more pro-social. We actually teach a wide variety of people. We kind of try to look towards young people, but we also teach even all the way through adults. Mostly the youngest we get is like late elementary school, early middle school. And some of those are kind of focused on a lot of it's social psych research, like the bystander effect. How does that happen? But also, how can you make yourself more pro-social using heroes as examples, things like that. So with this, how can peers support identity development? Well, we mentioned it a little bit ago. They can be a good sounding board. They can be a good place to test out new things. They can be a person, or you can work together with people to build your identity. So especially for late adolescents, early adults. So oftentimes, again, hopefully you remember, we usually see people settle on an identity for the first time, like their general life identity for their first time at about in between 16 and 26. So with that, oftentimes you're in romantic relationships, and you and your romantic partner will probably be exploring that together as well. Obviously, with a secure attachment, this is best. But yeah, having quality friendships gives you a lot of feedback as you're thinking about who you are, what is your role within your friend group, within the world at large. It can really help with identity development. So a couple of these definitions we kind of touched on before. So, oh, sorry, not definitions. We're jumping into adolescent development of friends. Sorry. I was getting confused by my slides. So as we move through middle childhood, through late childhood, and now into adolescence, we see that friend groups, so the peers that you're interacting with most often, that you call your friends, are getting smaller, but also more intense and more intimate throughout adolescence. So you're sharing more, spending more time, you care about them more as you get through adolescence. So some kind of dramatic numbers. At least to me, about 10% of the day of peers age 2 is spent, or 10% of your day at age 2 is spent with peers. Oftentimes, this is like, and again, this is an average. So some people that are age 2, just at home with parents, not with peers. And then some are actually with peers all day in daycare, right? But the average is about 10%. Jump that up to like the start of kindergarten, preschool at age 4, we see 20% of the day, because usually preschools and kindergartens are pretty short. Then when we get into actual elementary school age, we see about 40% of the day is spent with peers. This includes school time, this includes play after school, this includes like recess time. So there's still most of the day spent with parents, families, that kind of thing. But then when we jump into adolescence, on average, adolescents are spending twice as much time with their peers than their parents. It is dramatic, that change. And so this is one big reason that peers have such a big influence on adolescents. Adolescents want to hang out with their peers more than their parents. They probably find their peers less annoying than my preteen finds me. So with this, adolescents are also disclosing information, doing more intimacy with their friends than with their parents. So with an adolescent, he spends a lot of time sharing things with their friends. With this is also a very important time to watch for like the types of friends, or if you don't have friends for adolescents, because having few friends or no best friends or very little contact with friends is a very good predictor of depression, delinquency, and other problems in the future. So again, a peer are those individuals around the maturity level and age. Friends are the subset of peers that are there to that you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. They're giving you more direct support. You're being intimate with them and sharing things with them. So peer groups in adolescence provide a lot of information about the world. So as we talked about for identity development, it really helps to see other people, what their roles are, what they're trying to do, especially as they're trying to figure out identity at the same time. So this also again depends on the context of the different peers. So you might have a group of peers at school. You might have a different group of peers at church. And all of this is also related to your parents' management. So we probably talked about parent management at this point in the class. This is often kind of how we think about parents interacting with young people who are in adolescence. So it's really good for the parents to know like who the friends are, what kinds of things they're doing, and again, not like helicoptering, like being right there, but monitoring, having that open communication with the young person, and they can say with the values of the family or with the things that they want to do with the time that they have, what kinds of things that they want the adolescent to be involved in. So with that, they can have different peer groups in different places, and that's really helpful to have, say, like sports team, church, school, so that in each of those places they can try out a couple different roles. And if it doesn't work, then they switch it in one of those, right? So that kind of gives multiple options to try out different things as they are developing over time. So we do see that these relationships really help adolescents build those skills that they need for relationships in the future. So a lot of the skills that they're building and had started building from early childhood, middle childhood are clarified at this time. So with this, they're probably getting to a point where they're practicing more things like fairness and loyalty to friends. And with this, that's very helpful. Peer pressure at this time is also tends to be the most influential. So in early childhood, middle childhood, peer pressure isn't as powerful. Then as we get into early adulthood and middle adulthood, it's also not very powerful at all. But in adolescence, it's very powerful. So peer pressure is the worst for adolescents who don't have a clear social identity, especially if they have lower self-esteem, they have more anxiety, and especially if they're in some transition. So whether they're moving, changing schools, parents have been through a divorce, these kinds of transitions can really make them more susceptible to peer pressure. So again, these are all kind of risk factors for other negative outcomes for peer pressure. So that leads us to the question, who's more important in adolescent development? Is it parents or peers? So in-person classes, we'll often do a debate about this. So if you're in an in-person class, we will probably take some time to do that. If not, it might just be part of your other activities for the week. So now we'll move into adulthood, early adulthood, and to middle adulthood and late adulthood. I like this. Actually, it looks like we have a couple more slides in adolescence too, but I liked this as a transition for jumping into adulthood. It's definitely tough to schedule things with friends as you have other responsibilities too. So with this, we see a lot of positive outcomes related to positive friendships. So if you have strong friendships, if you have a core group of friends that you're interacting with, that you're sharing things with, you have lower rates of delinquency, risky sexual behavior, there's less bullying, victimization, and also a higher levels of academic achievement, exercise, so lots of positive things. Friends can lead to a lot of positive upward spirals, have a lot of benefits to things like stress, to mental health. All sorts of things are improved with good friends. Again, this doesn't have to be like 30 really good friends. It could be one or two or three, right? Every given person has a different number of friends that they really feel good with throughout their lifespan. And again, here in adolescence, we've kind of shrunk those friendships down from being a little bigger in middle and late childhood to adolescence. And generally, we see a little bit more shrinking as of those groups, but more stability, not as dramatic shrinking as we continue on through the lifespan. So with this, we see that when you are rejected by peers, when you have friends with depression, when you don't have close relationships with a best friend and less contact with friends, all of these things are really, really clear risk factors for increased depression in adolescence. So these are things to watch out for parents, mentors, coaches, people in the sphere of an adolescent's life. So watch out for them not having contact with their friends, not having friends, being rejected by peers. If they're losing contact with friends, this can be a really hard thing for them. So jumping to early adulthood, we've got a lot of information on this slide. Honestly, I should probably just split it into two. But there's a lot less research on early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood. But with this, we do see that these relationships are similar in emerging adulthood. to both adolescence and later adulthood. So we've kind of set some patterns now as we've moved into early adulthood. And with this, we have kind of our set kind of groups and context. So we have some relationship with friends, we have some relationships with family, we probably have romantic partners. So we have some kind of more integrated life with the friends and family members and other peers and things like this. We do see that the number of friendships decline a little bit as we go from adolescence to emerging adulthood. So again, this isn't as dramatic of a drop than we saw before, and this stays fairly consistent until we get to late adulthood. So one thing that we see when we look at college age students and specifically those going to college, we see that best friendships decline in satisfaction and commitment in that first year of college. So oftentimes, again, these are people in a transition period. They're usually very often in a different kind of context. So if you're going to school in the same place you went to high school, there's maybe some of the same peers, but it's a different context. It's a different kind of setting. And so you might be trying out different roles again, still developing identity at that time. So with that, one thing that we see for a lot of adults is maintaining that communication with high school friends, and keeping those same best friends really lessens that decline. It really keeps that friend group about the same size and doesn't lose that friend group. So this tends to be more dramatic when someone goes somewhere completely different than their core group of friends for college. It's much more predictive that you will keep your same friends from high school if you keep them as friends through college. So I know there are peers and friends that I had in high school that are still really good friends. They still hang out regularly because they kept those same friends. They didn't move away versus me. I moved very far away and I've actually literally never been back to the place I went to high school since that time, like nearby cities, but the actual city, haven't actually been back there since I graduated high school. So I've lost a lot of contact with a lot of those friends that I had over those years because we're just not maintaining that communication. And that is one thing that's really predictive of not having those long-term friendships throughout your life. So the most common very long-term friendships that stay into late adulthood are those that you develop those friendships earlier on, even in say middle school or high school, and you kept those friendships all the way into late adulthood. That's not to say that you cannot develop other friendships in adulthood, but we see that the most common pattern for long-term friends are those who just maintained that friendship over those many decades. So with that, in adulthood, women tend to have more friendships than men. They also have more intimacy in their friendships, so more back and forth, more sharing things with each other. So talking with one another versus male friends are more likely to do activities together. I've got a picture of a tailgate party here. Maybe the male friends are going and playing laser tag. Laser tag is on my mind lately. I haven't played for a while, and I think my kids are at an age where they actually want to do it. So I'm really excited about that. That'll be fun. We also see that cross-gender friendships become more common amongst adults. So it kind of split off from preschool time through early childhood, middle childhood, late childhood to adolescence as getting a little more gender specific. And now we see kind of a broadening out of more cross-gender friendships. So it's still not as common as same gender friendships. Those are still more common than having a variety of genders in the friendships. And this is one thing that we see in the research a lot. A lot of times, unclear sexual boundaries can produce tension and confusion, break up friendships, make it more challenging. And so that's something that, again, is a practice and in building relationships, building those skills to be able to do things like communicate and be clear about things like intentions or plans or things that you want out of relationships. And this is something that even later in adulthood, people are still working on as well. So when we jump all the way to late adulthood, we see some similarities throughout early and middle adulthood. But one thing that we see dramatically in late adulthood is that new friendships are much less likely to be forged at this time. As people grow older, they tend to even narrow down their friends even more to the couple that they find the most meaningful. So they're very reluctant to seek out new friends, but they try to maintain even just a couple relationships that are very strong and very important to them. We also see that they tend to have a lot, basically very few problems with their friends. They have um, they don't report negative qualities about their friends. They also have less frequent contact. And part of this goes to some of the things we talked about things like aging bodies and minds, that in late adulthood, it can be hard to get out and see your friend, to talk to your friend, to schedule time with them. But that kind of thing can be really predictive of other healthy behaviors in the future as well. So with this though, we see a lot of more positives at friendships at this time in life. So again, this is not to say that in adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood, you cannot build new friends. It's just a less common phenomenon in late adulthood to be seeking out new friendships. But we also see that those strong friendships are very, very predictive of longer life. So with this, other close relationships are things like love and marriage in midlife. So hopefully the person that you fall in love with and are marrying is also your friend. And so with these things, other pieces to that puzzle are security, loyalty, the mutual emotional interests. These are all really important too as you're building these close relationships. So most, as we get to middle adulthood, we see most middle adults are pretty satisfied with their marriages. In a previous chapter, we probably mentioned that divorce happens most commonly at about 7 years after marriage. So we also see that divorce rates have decreased for young adults, but increased for middle-aged adults. But still, the most common time is at about that 7 year mark. So another thing that we see with close relationships in adulthood is, especially as you have a middle adult who has children, like leaving the house and getting an empty nest, those were some close relationships that they had. So oftentimes what we will see is people refill the nest. So this might be an example of taking in other neighborhood kids, and this is like the house to hang out at, even though it's not your parents' house. It's like a surrogate parent's house. That's a fairly common thing. Another thing would be to have more parties at the house or have more people over more regularly, like be the hosts for family gatherings. So while the home has been emptied, the nest is now empty. There is also tends to be a refilling of that nest to have more of those close relationships, more of those interactions, especially with children outside the house. They might have more time to be able to do other things. But another thing that we see is that oftentimes people report a decrease in marital satisfaction after children leave home, which is a little surprising to people. They expect that marital satisfaction will go up, but this is also a time where they're trying to figure out again, after this transition, how to interact with each other. We have more time. Well, are we going to spend it together? How are we going to spend all this time together? So with that, parents also do get a lot of satisfaction from their children, from interacting with them, from getting some of those supports that we talked about from friendships. You're getting that from children as well. So with that and the refilling of the nest processes, you're going to lose some privacy with that as well, which is, if you remember back to a lot of things, this is one thing that people like about having like their own space as well. So sibling relationships are another example of close relationships. I've kind of jumped back and forth with siblings and families and the peer section, but we often see in adulthood that there's a wide variety of the way siblings interact with each other. So some siblings are really close, others just don't really care. They're pretty apathetic. Some are really rivalrous, so they have rivals in their siblings. So with this, though, any friendships that have endured over the adult years tend to be deeper as we continue on through adulthood. So if you are apathetic towards one of your siblings, you might continue to be apathetic. But if you are close already in your 20s, you'll probably be closer in your 30s. You'll probably be closer in your 40s, is the common pattern that we see. And so again, these close relationships with a sibling can give us those same benefits as we see from other friends that we talked about a little bit ago in this lecture. So, grandparenting is another example of close relationships that we haven't really touched on too much. We've talked about grandparents as like supporting young people, and having grandparents around can be a benefit, but it can also, we see some changes in the context of grandparenting. So, we see more grandparents being the primary caregivers. Usually, this is because of something like an adolescent pregnancy, drug use, being in prison, death as well. These are oftentimes reasons that grandparents will take over primary caregiving, and that can be very tough. So, grandparents are a little bit older, and so they might have more health concerns themselves. And so, chasing around, let's say, a 2 year old and a 5 year old is going to be a lot more energy and a little more difficult for them, even though it might be a very meaningful thing for them to do. So with this, we also see that intergenerational relationships can be more important as we go through adulthood. So with this, we see that middle-aged adults have a lot of responsibility of that. Oftentimes, they're kind of tying family together, trying to get their maybe adult children, but maybe younger children to be interacting with their parents, kind of trying to hold that together. But also, oftentimes, we see that middle adults are also dealing with the loss of the functions of their aging parents. They might have to be someone who is driving them to doctor's appointments. They might be having them in their house, literally to live there, after they're not able to care for themselves. And so, with this, there can be a wide variety of interactions. But in general, one of the things that we see fairly commonly is a little bit of ambivalence between both parents and their children throughout adulthood. So other things that we see is that mothers and daughters tend to have closer relationships than other groups in adulthood. We see that married men are more involved with their wives' families than their own on average. Again, that's not going to be the same for every single family. This is just on average. We also see that usually the mother's generational ties are more influential on the family dynamics. So that's like traditions from the family, from the mother's side, tend to be like stronger in the family. So, as we continue talking about friends and peers and other aspects of life, one of the aspects of friends and interacting with people is play. Play is relevant in early childhood, but it's also relevant as we go through adulthood as well. So, in early childhood, it's a really big part of cognitive development. It really helps with things that you're developing at the time, with interactions with objects, intentional behavior, using your prefrontal cortex, planning, goal setting, games. Especially in early childhood, it really helps with language and communication skills. A lot of games, a lot of play is using fine and gross motor skills, but it also gives big part, a big part of it is just practice with social interaction. So in early childhood, there is sensory motor or practice play. This essentially is play that builds senses and motor skills, looking at these blocks or things like that. That's really a lot of it is play, and it's fun, and it's building senses, building your motor skills, letting you taste a block, see what the texture of a wooden block is, that type of thing. Practice play is trying out new skills. So whether this is stacking blocks, whether this is hitting a hammer, that is practice. You can also practice social interactions in play. You can use symbolic plays, stand-ins for other objects. So a ball becomes a Pikachu if you don't actually have a Pikachu. So if you need a castle, the box becomes a castle, and that helps with how your brain works, right? That's a little bit abstract to think of a box as a house. It's not obviously that thing. So this really helps with abstract thinking. Social play involves other peers, and this is usually the main context where early children are interacting with peers is through social play. Constructive play is a little bit different. This is more combination of things. So you've got sensory motor, you've got symbolic play, you're doing games in the classroom, working together, creating things together. So if you're working on a puzzle, if you're building a big Lego creation with one another, you're playing Twister, right? You're using a lot of these play skills and practicing. Free play for a lot of children and adolescents has really decreased in recent decades. So, a lot of schools have sent more homework over time, and recess has even been eliminated to pack more academics into the day. And this can be a big problem because, especially with them doing more schoolwork at home and not playing as much, they're missing out on a lot of cognitive benefits for especially early children. The big benefits of play are their creativity, their abstract thinking, their imagination, concentration, persistence, problem solving, social cognition, building empathy, perspective taking, language, seeing themselves master new concepts and build that self-efficacy. So play is a really important part of early childhood. So the more that you can encourage young people to play in a variety of ways, the more that it's going to benefit them over their lifespan. And the more varied and different it is, it's going to be better as well. So just playing a single video game or playing with a single app is not going to be as beneficial as doing a variety of things with play, especially if you are in, say, school and you don't have as many resources, if you don't have playmates to play with at home, you're not going to get as much of the cooperation, the sharing, the turn taking, the having challenges and having to work through challenges, getting the self-confidence, comparing yourself to others. But also, there are other socio-emotional benefits. It can be relaxing to play. It can be enjoyable. It's a way to express yourself. So there's a lot of positives to play. I often find myself telling my kids if they're if it's time to get off a screen, why it's important to play, and it's important to play because that's kind of a kid's job. It's one of the main ways you learn as a young person is through play. And we can build skills too through play, even as adults. So, looking at adolescence, so a definition of leisure here is the pleasant time when an individual is free to choose their own activities or hobbies or interests. So, reading, sports, doing art, whatever it might be, playing music. So, we see that US adolescents spend more time on leisure activities than adolescents in a lot of other industrialized cultures. So, about 40 to 50% of their free time is spent in leisure activities. Versus in a lot of other cultures, there is a little more structured time for adolescence. So it might be more intentional practice for things like sports or clubs or skills, even though it might be something outside of school that they're not required to do, that maybe they've chose to do, these kinds of things. And so the benefit or the negative of this really depends on how that time is used. If it's all spent playing Candy Crush or something like that, that's not really using your brain very much, it's not going to be very beneficial. But if it's maybe a little more structured or intentional on the part of the adolescent, it can be really helpful. So we see a lot of young people are just watching shows. That is a big part of their leisure time in the US. Talking is another big thing. So that's oftentimes talking to friends, texting with friends. Sports is a fairly common one. Another it is structured voluntary activities. So this might be like practicing musical instruments, practicing art, that kind of thing. And then total free time, we see some of these number differences for the US here in this column. And we see Europe in this column and East Asia in this column. And so that can lead to some differences. Again, it seems like a little bit more structure for adolescents. And again, this can be decided by the adolescents. This doesn't have to be forced on the adolescents, but a little more structure or intention for doing specific activities that they're wanting to build skills for seems to be very helpful. So with this, we see a lot of screen-based activities. So the graph just before or the table was showing show watching, TV viewing. we see that adolescents have a lot of unstructured leisure time, a lot of time spent on screens, pursuing a lot of things that are just very passive. So here I found this picture of a Halo LAN party. This actually looks fairly similar to when I was a freshman in college, uh, playing Halo with peers late into the night. Um, some of my peers failed out of school because they played Halo too much, didn't ever get any sleep, and then could not get up for their classes, which was too bad. So, with that being said, structured activities tend to hold some more benefits. So, again, this can be things that they want to do, hobbies that they want to build, skills that they want to build, that they might like to do. So, more structure tends to be a little better. It doesn't have to be dictated, though, to adolescents. So, we also see a lot of differences in screen time now than we did in the past. So, now, as opposed to the past, the only screen time might have been TV, even 30 years ago. But now there's email, instant messaging, social network sites, chat rooms, video sharing, photo sharing, multiplayer games, virtual worlds, VR. There's a whole lot of interaction with screens. And so there's a lot of research on how these have some positive and negative outcomes. So we see that one of the biggest worries for adolescents is social media. And so with this, we see that text messaging as well is one of the main ways that young people are contacting with their friends. So a big part of this, especially in early adolescence, is the concern with sexting. So this is something that should be included in things like comprehensive sex education, to encourage young people not to be sending sexually explicit images, videos in text messages. Oftentimes, again, they might not be thinking far ahead into their lifespan of the kinds of impacts that this might have on them. So, helping understand that and set up an environment where it's safe to talk about it and safe to understand and have those kind of conversations is important. So, with this, a big key of all the research is that in general, parents just need to monitor and regulate the use of the internet a little better than they generally do. So a lot of young people have kind of unfettered access to the internet through, say, cell phones or tablets. And for adolescents, they might be viewing things that are not age appropriate and that the parents might not want them to be interacting with, but that the parents don't know because the parents aren't a monitor of that. So as we jump into middle adulthood or adulthood in general, we see that in adulthood, we tend to have people with more time, more money for vacations, for doing leisure activities. Oftentimes, as we get into middle adulthood, there's more opportunities to diversify interests and try out new things that you might have done in the past but haven't done for a while. And with this, we see that people who take vacations, who do take time for leisure, have lots of other cognitive benefits. That being said, again, this is correlational. If you have the money to take, let's say, a cruise, you are probably less stressed in general. You probably have a job that pays enough that you're probably not in poverty, right? So there are numerous health benefits. It might not be directly causally related from the vacations and leisure time, but we do see some cognitive benefits from leisure time as well. Taking a break, letting your brain take breaks is very important. So that doesn't have to be week-long things, but having leisure time is very important. So with that, we come to a little review of the materials that we've covered in this class. So depending on the class, this review might come in a different chapter. It depends which chapter is the last. In the time I'm recording this, this is the last chapter. But hopefully from what we've talked about, you see that development is a lifelong process. Even today, we've talked about childhood, late adulthood, and all the time in between. And development is that change over time across the lifespan. Development is multidimensional. Development affects all the different aspects of and includes the different aspects of your biology, your behavior, your personality, your health, all of these sorts of things. So you as an individual, you are a developmental system. You are a person with a bunch of different pieces that make up you as a person, and you are changing over time. So you are a relational developmental system. Development is also multi-directional. Things grow and shrink at different times on average. You can build a skill and see it grow. You can maybe stop working on that skill and see it shrink. Development is relatively plastic. So we have the capacity for change. A lot of that is down to our brains. A lot of that is down to our neurons and those connections. Almost anything can change to some degree at every point in life. Not everything, but a lot of things in our development. Development's also contextual. Today we focused, or when I recorded this section was very focused on peers. How do peers affect development over the lifespan? But we've also talked about schools, families, the neighborhoods, history in general, the cultures that people come from. All these are examples of the settings or the context that affect how we change over time. Development also looks at maintenance. So it is growth, it is loss, but it's also maintenance. How do we maintain those capacities that we have? So development is kind of all the things: health, well-being, sociocultural context, diversity. So hopefully when you look at these models, so here on the left, we see Richard Lerner's, sorry, I just was going to say it was this model's name. So developmental contextual systems theory versus here we've got Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. Developmental contextual model, bioecological systems theory. I might have mixed those two up, but really they both come from the same meta theory of Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. And this is just another model kind of pinpointing a couple more relationships with these bidirectional arrows. But hopefully when you look at this, it makes a little more sense that a lot of things affect us and that some things that are closer related to us have a bigger direct impact, even though things like the culture that we're in still have an impact. We might not have a direct impact there, but we have some indirect impacts on that broader culture. Also, when we look at this picture of developmental cascades, hopefully you can see this as an example. Let's just take a quick example of peers. So maybe you have a lot of strong peer groups, then you move and you don't have a lot of strong peer groups. Maybe you're at a risk factor for negative outcomes. Let's say negative outcomes are over here, positive outcomes are over here. But then you start building those social skills, you have more friends towards positive outcomes. Again, almost anything can change to some degree at every point in our life. So you can think of any capacity or you yourself as a water droplet running down this river and changing over time, being pushed and pulled both by genetics, epigenetics, the context that you're in. So here, they might push or pull you with protective factors, risk factors as you develop over time. So one thing I definitely want lifespan classes to take away from this is some of the main things that help you over time. So focusing on your health and fitness, trying both mental health and physical health to keep that fitness up across the lifespan, preserving your mind, being engaged cognitively, trying new things, learning new things, whatever it might be that interests you, continuing your vocation. While that might not be a paid job, hobbies, things that you're engaged with that you like to do, keeping up relationships with families and friends. So these kind of peer relationships have a big positive impact, decreasing stress, giving us support, are fun and engaging, staying involved in the community. So in the relationships and lives of people around us, in the kinds of systems that are around us, and then beyond the self-engagement. Again, if you're doing things with and for other people, you're going to be happier, healthier. You can combine a lot of these things at the same time. They don't have to be separate activities. If you're involved in the community, you're probably making friends. It's probably engaging your mind. It's probably beyond the self. So there are ways to do this at the same time. So for the time I'm recording this, this is the last lecture of the class. So thank you for being part of it. And thank you for learning about lifespan development. This is a pretty brief overview, but hopefully you have a good sense of some of the more recent research here about systems theories and how things interact with one another over the lifespan.